Hello.
So we didn't have a trailer, so we have to kind of set the foundation here, and we'll show some clips in a little bit. But it's a story about a guy who goes to prison. We can start with that much information, and it's sort of based on if not a true story, a real world. So, David, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Jonathan Asser, the writer, is by profession a therapist within the prison system, and he evolved a kind of therapy for very violent prisoners who were not being given access to any other kind of therapy. And within the movie itself, there's a character played by Rupert Friend, who you may know from Homeland and other things, who it basically plays the same as Jonathan plays. He's called Oliver, but it's very similar to the reality of Jonathan's life. And so we had a scriptwriter who was putting a lot of his own experience and the authenticity of his voice and his own anger and his own sort of feelings into the material, which we then we ran with that ball and made the film. I think the film has a very strong vibe of authenticity with some fantastically authentic performances led by Jack. I think that comes, among many other things, from the original script material.
And could we just add one more plot detail, which is it's also a family drama of sorts. So that's another element I think people wouldn't necessarily expect from a story like this.
Maybe, Jack, you can talk about that, the relationship between somebody else and...
No, at home, if you describe something as a family drama, that's a description of the audience, usually. So I won't be able to second that in this case. But there's a father-son sort of storyline and a reunion that's been elongated, and they've been absent from each other's lives for however long. And it's totally unideal, the realm in which they meet up in again. And I think we spoke earlier, didn't we? And things had occurred to me during that interview which I didn't really recall on set at the time, even up until we spoke. So we're talking like a good year's passed since I had this dawning of realisation today that the person that I think Eric idolised as a father figure in his father's absence turned up to be so far removed from the reality that also brought its own conflict, so that he kind of had to strike down anything that he once perceived his father being, and then I guess start again somehow. Yeah.
So tell us, as an actor at your stage, a lot of people get these sort of pressures to go big, to do these studio projects with superheroes and so forth. You've been around a little bit, and yet you're doing a project like this, which is not the most, let's say, obvious commercial opportunity, and yet, it delivers. So talk a little bit about what this particular project, which is so gritty and dark, was, interesting to you.
Well, I guess because it's enclosed, particularly in Britain, we don't really get an insight into prisons mainly at all. I think up until about a decade ago, it was actually illegal to shoot anything in a prison environment. So there's always been a huge curiosity, I guess, generally, for cinema audiences and, across the board. So for me, it was a nice opportunity to go somewhere, I guess, a bit secret and kind of justify and provide an explanation for a youngster who's all too commonly wrote off as a reprobate and needs locking up and, I guess, the key throwing away. So I just welcome the idea of analysing the psychology there as to what it is to, I guess, be rock bottom. And in my experience as well, thankfully, Jonathan, he still had good contacts with people that he tried to therapeutic. And I think when speaking to them as well, you saw the utmost respect that they had for Jonathan. And then that gave us an availability or opportunity to talk with them, previous inmates themselves. And I think one of the most stark characteristics that I find in these people were that a lot of the time they were very generous and very warm, very approachable individuals that have a very violent reputation. So I kind of wanted to introduce that to the role. I thought it was very obvious to assume that he was just permanently angry and intolerable in that way. So I kind of wanted to make him slightly likeable to a degree.
And David, were you okay with this notion of making this prisoner more of a likable character?
It was absolutely essential. The kind of the humanity thread that runs through the film with almost all the characters, and the idea that people who are deemed to be kind of irredeemable in many ways, having the light shone on them, so that they're allowed to at least show different sides of their personality. It was a very important part of the project from beginning to end, to be honest. And it's a hard journey to take, where you have a character who's obviously troubled, violent, got a lot going on, but also is a kid and looking to try and find a relationship with somebody who has expectations of, and to build a relationship with other people, for example, in the group, and to survive in this very, very hostile environment. And that's kind of the soup that we're making this movie from.
So we have one clip that sort of illustrates that hostile environment. Do one of you want to set that up right quick before we show it?
Which is a clip again? I know there's one or two.
The first one that we saw.
It's them coming into the cell, yeah.
Where I get lubricated and such. Very cold. No central heating in this disused prison anymore, which makes sense. And I remember a few of the crew coming up to me on that day, shaking my hand, telling me that they didn't envy me too much that day. So I found that weirdly rewarding, I guess.
Yeah,
check it out.
Let's take a look. A lot happens at that point, but it's certainly worth seeing the whole movie to get that full scene. But tell us about sort of conceptualizing the intensity of that, because that's right at the start of the movie, so you're really sort of setting the stage for a very visceral experience.
Yeah, and it's the first sort of 15 minutes of the movie before that happens are much sort of more slow-paced and deliberate and building up tension, and then this is the sort of first sort of explosion of tension. What's happened just before this is that Jack's character has accidentally hurt somebody who was actually trying to do him a favor, and that's been misread as an act of violence, and so the prison officers are coming down on him. And it's sort of the first major incident of the movie, I'd say, and it sort of propels the movie into the next dimension. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah. Did you have an idea of how physically demanding these kinds of scenes were going to be?
Well, I guess so, yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily mind it so much. I feel like it's one of my job entailments. I take a lot of satisfaction out of putting my stunt double out of work at times. I guess it's part of the fun.
I don't think you had a stunt double on this job, did you?
Florence, yeah. Florence was there, but he didn't really do much. He was just helping out in other ways most of the time. But we used him for a shot. I remember we used him for a shot, which I'm pissed off about, David.
And for rehearsals and all that.
To be honest with you, I'm fuming. We're going to have to talk about this, Gillian.
Well, one thing that's important to point out is it's not just a movie that's pure, action and sort of physical discomfort. There is actually a pretty heavy plot that goes on in terms of the relationships between the characters, not only the father and the son, but the nature of the psychologist character, which is sort of, I assume, based on the screenwriter's experience. So can you talk a little bit about sort of fleshing out that universe?
Well, you have the two central relationships within the movie. One is obviously the relationship between the father or the son and his father. They haven't seen each other since Jack's character was 5 years old, and there's a lot of expectation there. Their name is Love, their surname is Love, and yet they know very little about love, either of them, which is kind of obviously a deliberate ploy by Jonathan. And they're reaching out to each other in some very awkward, very locked down emotional way, but experiencing feelings that they've not really experienced before, and there's a process of that runs through the film. But there's also another major relationship, which is the prison therapist who introduces Eric to his very strange, very radical therapy session where people are encouraged to get angry and then encouraged to learn how to deal with it. So you have a process of escalation, which we've seen a lot of in movies, but also a process of de-escalation, which is one of the most dramatic and interesting parts of the process. And through that, Jack's character Eric gets builds relationships with people, and almost you could almost say makes friends or makes the beginnings of friendships, and is kind of socialized by that. But all the other forces that are at work in the jail, including some corruption, including people who don't want him to succeed, are all and his own kind of anxiety and anger, are all working to sort of fight against some of these positive influences that are there. But the idea of this film is to take a prison genre movie and confound expectations on a number of levels, and to introduce things that that at points where you're not expecting them. And so it's a journey through a narrative that is hopefully a satisfactory and original and interesting and in some way a touching experience.
Yeah, and we have a clip that shows some of the way that system sort of bears down on him. But can you talk a little bit first about, what do you think about how this thing works, in terms of how we see it in the movie? I mean, do you think that, is this a film that's criticizing the conditions that this person is going through, or is there something that's positive about the way that it works?
Well, I mean, I think you get a glimpse of some of this therapy being positive, it being something that actually, obviously, I mean, it feels dangerous, it feels brave for the therapist who's on his own without any other officers in the room, but it feels like it's kind of working. But in most cases, you feel the dysfunction of the prison system. The film itself is not deliberately trying to particularly criticize any particular thing. This is a backdrop, and you see the complexities of it, as opposed to it being, this is a searing indictment of the prison system. I mean, that didn't feel appropriate to this film. It feels it's about a human drama within a hostile environment, and about a young man trying to come to terms with a lot of things and in some way moving forward. So that's kind of what I hope it is. This clip that's coming is a really interesting scene where Eric is being given a second chance and he deliberately decides to blow it. And maybe Jack should talk a little bit about it.
When I read the scene originally, separated I guess the assumption that Eric was quite mindless with his approach, or mindless as an individual. In my opinion, he kind of puts the onus back onto his superiors in this context, very intelligently, and he's able to strip bare and put the sort of the contradictions in the legal justice system in a kind of transparent light, or like I say, he's able to strip bare and kind of no nonsense. Again, he puts the onus back on these people who are dictating his future. At which point, when I was reading the script, that separated Eric to me from a child to a man. He then struck me as someone who was capable of thinking very maturely, which meant that all of his actions had to be to some degree measured,
Yeah, let's take a look.
Before we do take a look, I want to say it was one of the late additions to the script, and it was something that I felt very important to me, that we had a chance to see Eric was articulate when he wanted to be, because he actually chooses to be quite inarticulate in many ways. And he doesn't speak very much to many people. And this is a chance to see that he was intelligent, articulate, and capable of putting his point across. And so it came as a late addition. And actually, I have to say, it was slightly inspired by, there's a great scene in Made in Britain, which is Tim Roth's debut film by Alan Clark, where he kind of attacks the system. And this is something that felt it was appropriate for him to do, and Jonathan wrote this scene. And what he is saying in this scene is kind of true of the criminal justice system, kind of everywhere. There are vested interests at play. So it's a chance. This is actually a small kind of chance to actually really hone in on the issues. But it's a character development point as well.
Alrighty. In the few moments where it's actually okay to laugh in that movie, I think. in the next few minutes before we open it up to a Q&A, I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenges of even making a movie like this and getting people to see it. You know, we live in a society where people like sanitized entertainment. You know, comedy tends to be an easy defense mechanism for dealing with certain things. You don't hold back much with a movie like this. And you've also made movies in the United States before, so can you tell us a little bit about sort of what is the challenge of pushing out a film like this, which doesn't really make things easy on its audience?
Well, I mean, the film's just been released in the United Kingdom, where it did pretty well in the box office and was released fairly widely and was well received. The performances were very well recognized. So I guess the United States is a slightly different thing because the language, there's English prison slang, which is maybe a little bit more impenetrable to United States audience. It's very important to me that, I mean, I didn't understand half the words in the script because they're prison slang, and I don't know prison, that well myself. So it doesn't, you get to know it. You accumulate yourself with this this language, and I'm extremely proud that Tribeca are planning to put the film out in the United States without any subtitles, and so the experience of accumulating an understanding of the language is what you go through and make in when you watch the movie. And that's thrilling to me. I think it's a movie that's got lots of things for lots of audiences. I'm very surprised by the number of women who respond to an almost exclusively male environment. It seems to kind of reach out to teenagers. It seems to reach out to people older. I'd love to see this film being released as widely as possible and finding as big an audience as possible. Obviously, it's not too much of a sort of popcorn fare, but it has tension, it has a lot of good drama, it has fantastic performances, it has some very strong relationships, and a story that can grip you. So I remain optimistic about the film kind of finding an audience.
And certainly, Jack, I would say you are on the verge of I don't to put too fine a point on it, but sort of being everywhere. I mean, I saw you in a movie just a few months ago called 71, a really terrific war film that's coming out in the United States in a few months. And you were recently the star in the latest feature from this up-and-coming filmmaker named Angelina Jolie. So, you got stuff going on, and yet, faced with those sort of choices, it seems like you're being pretty calculated about what you're saying yes and no to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess my no's are just as crucial as my yeses, I'd say. And it's always been my intention. I'm very, very fortunate to now be working consistently and be reflecting on years of integral work, I guess. And I see intention to upkeep that. And I guess from an early age, I kind of was able to distinguish between the difference of being a kind of, I guess, for want of a better phrase, a flash in a pan. And that's not what I'd set out to achieve, Hopefully a nice, colourful body of work to look back on one day, which suggests a diversity. That's a long-term game. But for now, I kind of had to utilise my strengths and kind of take what I was given. So with that said, I got extremely lucky that Startup was made at this particular point, and this particular point in my career as well, because this film actually helped me gain the role on Unbroken with Angie. So it's interesting how you see things have a knock-on effect, and they all contribute. But also I've been lucky as well to I've sussed out from a young age that the fame and the celebrity side of this line of work is a byproduct, and it shouldn't be the priority. I'd like the work to speak for itself, and I'm infinitely proud of this film. I think I'm going to be an old man one day. That's the intention anyway, provided everything goes well, touch wood. And then I can show my kids this film when I was in my heyday, as it were, and that's one of the finer things. I think one of the biggest rewards.
Presumably not when they're too young.
Yeah, well, maybe to deter them from, as a deterrent, maybe.
So we've covered a lot here, but I'm sure there's questions in the audience, so let's do that part of it.
Hi. So first of all, thank you to all of you just for being here. So my question is for Jack. This story about this person who's lost and I guess, filled with anxiety and surrounded by violence, and manages to grow and become likable. And I guess this isn't the first time you've played a role where a character has been surrounded by violence and still manages to seem likable. So I guess how do you approach that when you get a role? How do you find that likability in him?
I but like, I guess judge them fairly and without prejudice. And I think that's one of the best features of this film too. Is I think across the board, across the divide, but we handled the portrayal of every character, I guess, to the best of our ability without prejudice. And that's how I approach my characters when I'm preparing them. You know, whether I agree or not with Eric, I guess, is a separate conversation. But I think in Eric's case, he does have, you know, very redeemable qualities about him. You know, he strikes him as a very fair individual, however violent. He certainly wasn't a bully. So I was able to respect Eric very easily, and to do that, then you begin to study them, and it certainly wasn't a case of walking around Crumlin Road Jail with a frown all the time, just constantly angry at everyone, because that wouldn't have been very interesting, I don't think. So it was a case of just normalising the individual, perceiving them and getting to know them a little. And thankfully, you know, I kind of have references from home and stuff, so I guess I was able to utilise that, you know. And I guess the distinction between people pretending to be fearless and maybe in Eric's case being to a degree slightly fearless, but the intention was never to make him seem immune or superhuman in any way, because we have to empathise with him, I think.
Did you have any people that you got a chance to interview, role models or models for the character? And can you tell us a little bit of your story of your interaction and what you drew on?
In terms of how where I grew up, and yeah, okay, so Jonathan Asser, with him actually living this story to a degree. He had his own contacts again, you know, previous inmates had since, you know, been released, and they were more than happy to come and at least advise us. So that has offered us an opportunity to get face to face with these people, and then that confirmed to me that Eric didn't need to be totally angry all the time. He could afford to be gentle, perhaps generous, maybe even likable. In a world where weakness or generosity is mistaken for weakness, it helped me give him a layer or two, you know. Yes, so there were three lads all together that we liaised with regularly, and they came to the screening in Hackney, and to gain their approval in the way they did, I thought that was a big success for us all. I guess it's a testament to the film, because it was important to me mainly to authenticate this film for inmates, people who know the system, and it did that. You know, it provoked a reaction from a previous prison guard in the audience. Pretty interesting one. It's online if you want to see it, and yeah, to see these ex-inmates as well also in a grill was a huge achievement. I'd like to say anyway.
Was it easy for you to like fit the role that you were chosen to play?
What, this one?
Yeah.
Surprisingly easy, yeah, quite worryingly so, I reckon. Frightening. But yeah, I felt like I was preparing this role for a while without knowing it had ever come to it, you know. I'd always wanted to epitomise a sort of, I guess, what we regard as a villain and excuse him. Good question there, my lovely. Good for you.
Was there a particular scene that you knew that if you didn't get right, if you didn't do it right, you know, the movie wouldn't work? Or you just, is there one scene in your head that, you know, that you just knew you had to get right?
I'd find it tricky to single out one. I think that's pretty, I mean, with projects like this too, and in my experience, I'm thankfully I'm able to feel very passionate about the projects that I do, because, you know, more times than often they're really, really good, you know, and that's because of everyone involved, you know. So it's always my intention to get it right, man. And I guess there's never a scene where we can afford to not commit 110%, because the audience will smell it, you know, and particularly with neo-realism. So. Getting my penis out in a sort of global scale is always daunting, particularly in a facility where they can't facilitate central heating. The lukewarm, David, because of the steam, at best.
You just added a whole bunch of context to that scene right there.
I love the revolving doors, by the way. I have to let you know about that. That gave me chills. And then a question for you. You do angry characters a lot. Is there anything you do to get that anger, like music, or you're not method, are you?
Well, no, not entirely.
That's a bad thing.
No, sure. I mean, no, fair point. I mean, I guess it makes for interesting drama to some degree. But yeah, there's things like music, and you know, perhaps before the scene, you know, I might be in a pretty frightening headspace, but I find it quite crucial to have a cut-off point too. And yeah, no, I'm very keen to play some perhaps warm people, you know, do-gooders one day. So.
Congratulations to both of you, because it was a really beautiful film. I just came from a screening, so it's still with me, and I feel like it's one of those that will just stay with you. And I guess I was wondering, the movie is very silent. There's not much music really until the end, and I was wondering if that was intentional on your part.
Yeah, completely intentional. From quite early on in the process, wanting not to use music to push the audience into an emotional place, and to use the performances and to use the atmosphere of the place and the tensions that are there, to function in its own right without music was a real challenge, but I felt it was appropriate. I actually did the music myself, and I'm a non-musician, so and it was just about making weird sounds, because I thought I've worked with a lot of musicians, and I'm very keen on music in movies, and I just thought asking a musician to make non-musical sounds was actually, you know, kind of contradictory, so it's better to choose a non-musician like myself. So I was sort of twiddling knobs and making kind of odd. They're just kind of there as an underbed, but you don't even know they're there, and it just to push a little bit. But basically, until the last act, the last, you know, few scenes, you don't really feel the presence of music there at all in the film, and we needed it to drive the last part, because the film becomes a little bit more heightened at the end. But the absence of it, I think, makes you feel engaged in the world, and makes all the sounds of the world, that, you know, the sound design qualities come alive more. I'm very proud of the kind of the austerity of that choice and what it does to allow the performances to do the emotional work.
Would you agree with that? Would you find that as a viewer?
Which is weird, because normally music is used to make you tense. So it's quite nice to know that you can do it another way, you know.
It's also very much a film that's riddled with close-ups. It seems like you rely very much on expressions and smaller, you know, moments to draw people in. And it's very untraditional in that respect. If you have not had the luxury of seeing the film yet, and you think that this is something you'd like to see, hopefully we've given you a couple reasons. It opens pretty soon, right?
I don't know when it. It's
been a
I
whirlwind.
think Trevor are talking about August or some kind of summer release. You know.
Gillian's nodding.
But
August.
It's coming up. It's playing here at the film festival, so you have some chances to see it here. Word of mouth makes a big difference with movies like this, and again, I think this is one of the best ones you're going to see this year. So don't miss out. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. Cheers.
You've been around a little bit, and yet you're doing a project like this, which is not the most, let's say, obvious commercial opportunity, and yet, you know, it delivers. So talk a little bit about what this particular project, which is so gritty and dark, was, you know, interesting to you.
Well, I guess because it's enclosed, you know, particularly in Britain, we don't really get an insight into prisons mainly at all. I think up until about a decade ago, it was actually illegal to shoot anything in a prison environment. So there's always been a huge curiosity, I guess, generally, you know, for cinema audiences and, you know, across the board. So for me, it was a nice opportunity to go somewhere, I guess, a bit secret and kind of justify and provide
The script material.
And could we just add one more plot detail, which is it's also a family drama of sorts. So that's another element I think people wouldn't necessarily expect
I mean,
from a story like this.
Maybe Jack, you can talk about that, the relationship between somebody else and...
Oh yeah, no, at home, if you describe something as a family drama, that's a description of the audience usually. So I won't be able to second that in this case. But there's a father-son sort of storyline and a reunion that's been elongated, and they've been absent from each other's lives for however long. And it's totally unideal, the realm in which they meet up in again. And I think we spoke earlier, didn't we? And things had occurred to me during that interview which I didn't really...
Hello.
So we didn't have a trailer, so we have to kind of set the foundation here, and we'll show some clips in a little bit. But it's a story about a guy who goes to prison. We can start with that much information, and it's sort of based on if not a true story, a real world. So, David, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Jonathan Asser, the writer, is by profession a therapist within the prison system, and he evolved a kind of therapy for very violent prisoners who were not being given access to any other kind of therapy. And within the movie itself, there's a character played by Rupert Friend, who you may know from Homeland and other things, who...
recall on set. At the time, even up until we spoke. So we're talking like a good year's passed since I had this dawning of realisation today that the person that I think Eric idolised as a father figure in his father's absence turned up to be so far removed from the reality that also brought its own conflict, so that he kind of had to strike down anything that he once perceived his father being, and then I guess start again somehow. Yeah.
So tell us, as an actor at your stage, a lot of people get these sort of pressures to go big, to do these studio projects with superheroes and so forth.
He basically plays the same as Jonathan plays. He's called Oliver, but it's very similar to the reality of Jonathan's life. And so we had a scriptwriter who was putting a lot of his own experience and the authenticity of his voice and his own anger and his own sort of feelings into the material, which we then we ran with that ball and made the film. I think the film has a very strong vibe of authenticity with some fantastically authentic performances led by Jack. I think that comes, among many other things, from the original.